So when you talk about China, you alluded to China earlier, and I've actually said in a way that I think people have misinterpreted that that Chinese influence in Latin America is a good thing, not because I have some type of naive view of China or an idealized view of China. A lot of people actually sort of get complain on the other side of the equation when I criticize things about China. But that the point is that allowing for multipolarity in Latin America and the Caribbean gives more of a capacity for a Korea government, as an example, to choose its own way because there isn't one hegemonic presence sort of dominating everything. So what was that your sort of understanding of the importance, among other things, of cultivating a relationship with China? Was just the idea that if Latin America is going to be genuinely independent and follow its own development path, it needs to broaden out its relationships with essentially places with a lot of capital and a lot of room to invest.
Yes, I think that, I mean, essentially the point you've made is correct. I mean, not having all your eggs in the same baskets, we say in Ecuador.
Right,
So,
right.
in terms of your foreign policy, in terms of your alliances, is really important. And breaking that sort of historic dependency with the United States. I mean, we always told, I mean, when I was foreign minister, we always told the United States, we want a great relationship with the United States. And there are lots of things we admire about the United States. And in fact, there were even some things that in our policies that we thought, oh, look, that's how they did it in the United States. That worked. Maybe we can replicate this. There was no sort of visceral anti-Americanism. Before I was foreign minister, I worked in the higher education system. I was minister for a while there, and there were lots of things about the US universities. Some things we didn't replicate because we didn't agree with, but others we did. There was no, and in fact, we tried to create lots of scientific partnerships with US universities because we wanted to develop a lot of sort of scientific research agendas, including with the biogenetic of the Amazon basin. Lots, there was really, the United States was one of the countries I visited the most. It was no visceral anti-Americanism. But clearly, there's a problem with the relationship with the United States, and that is the US security doctrine, essentially going back to the early 19th century, which is the Western Hemisphere for the United States, right? And the Western Hemisphere as a backyard. In the Monroe Doctrine in the early days, 1823, right, James Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine was maybe it could be interpreted as an anti-colonial doctrine, right? So America's for the Americans. Well, what does that mean? Is it America's for the Americans as in we're all Americans in the Americas, or Americans for the United States Americans, right? Mm-hmm. And over time, the Monroe Doctrine became more and more Americans for the North Americans, right? So it was used to prevent any other region of the world from interacting with Latin America. So certainly during the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and more recently with China. And clearly, Latin Americans should be allowed to trade with everyone, to have ties with everyone. So to bring China on board was really, really important in that sense, because, we could say, oh, this is how much our products are worth, instead of sending them to, just to give you an example, in the mid-1990s, Ecuador probably exported, in the early 90s, Ecuador exported 85% of its exports went to the United States. Now it's more like 35%, right? Still very important, and it's a key trading partner, but that dependency has there's been a great diversification, and that is good for Ecuador, and that is good for Latin America. So, that was probably the key thinking. Also in terms of liquidity, right? China has a lot of liquidity. In fact, over the recent years, it's had more liquidity than the United States. So that was key in terms of, developing certain areas of our economy, getting joint ventures, but also loans, but also for economic reasons, it was very interesting. The other thing which I think is important is that China imposes less conditionalities in every single sense of the word. So I'm not saying China is an innocent bystander in the international system. China has its interests, and it sometimes pushes them, insistently. And I'm not trying to romanticize China here, but certainly in its relations with other, it doesn't have this kind of what the French used to call mission civilisatrice, right? So to try and impose a political system
Right.
or a vision of the world, whereas the United States still does, right? So, if you're a leftist leader in Ecuador, you might be the best leader in history, but you're not gonna be received in the White House, right? But the moment you get some right-wing dictator or someone like Lenin Moreno comes in, then it's red carpet, right?
Right.
China doesn't think like that. Right? China tries to, so that is also something which is important, right? It's there's more respect for the political system of the other, for the sovereignty of the other, for the institutions of the other. In the United States, it's if you're not with me, then I'm going to fight you, and I'm going to try and overthrow you, and I'm going to try and regime change is a real constant of U.S. foreign policy. Now, there is some caution to be exerted with China too. China is still fundamentally interested in the same things as the United States, as a matter of fact, as the European Union, in terms of its trading relationship with countries from the global periphery, from the global south. So it's still looking for raw materials. And so for Latin American countries, and certainly that was our mission, who are trying to change their role in international division of labor, if you like, trying to move away from just exporting raw materials and importing everything else, who are trying to diversify their economy. And sometimes that will mean applying also protectionist policies in order to develop vulnerable industries or to develop certain sectors without, products from the United States or China or elsewhere just killing that possibility because they're cheaper or more competitive. Whatever. That sometimes requires also some approach to China. I mean, China today is quite happy signing some free trade agreements with rather similar clauses than the United States would impose, right? So those kinds of things, there you can have an approach where you say, well, China, we're interested in this, but we're not interested in that. And, you don't have to just, be 100% on board with everything China says or sign everything China proposes. I mean, that's certainly not what we did. And in fact, we tried constantly to engage the Chinese in terms of investing in areas of our economy that were not based on the export of raw materials. China bought some of our oil, and that was probably some of the stuff that interested China, more. But in exchange, we said, okay, we'll sell you some oil, but please come and invest in this scientific project, or come and invest in this and that. So, there's no perfect solution, and I don't believe in alignment, wholesale alignment in either China or the United States. As a peripheral state, you've got to try and build your own policies. You've got to use different international actors in a way that is most convenient, most strategic, and most intelligent for you. But certainly, China has been more respectful, I would say, of institutions, political systems, and sovereignty of countries like Ecuador than the United States has been, without a doubt. Because the United States still has this doctrine that it has two great oceans that protect it in terms of its security, the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Oceans. And that's its max, and it's great. It gives it a lot of security. It even gives it times, like physical minutes before, in order to stop an aggression, a missile or whatever. Right. But that condition only works if the Western Hemisphere is literally pacified. And unfortunately, pacification has not been through always the tools of consensus and respect and mutual recognition, and sometimes literally through kind of bully tactics of I will be your boss, and that is going to work less and less in this century with other actors on board, such as China, but also others. And I think that this is a parenthesis we're living now with this lawfare we were talking about and this kind of return of a very aggressive neoliberal right. But by and large, what we saw in the first decade and a half of the 21st century is more likely to be the norm in the 21st century for Latin America than the exception, because it's in Latin America's interest to diversify its tie and not be sort of under the control or domination of the US hegemon.
That's a really inspiring note to leave on. And